looking at a genuinely explosive debate that just took place right on the floor of the UK House of Commons. Now, migration policy is a deeply complex, highly emotional topic, and as you probably know, the rhetoric around it can get incredibly fierce. But in this explainer, we're going to cut right through all that noise. We're going to objectively break down the exact arguments, the proposed policies, and the hard data presented by both sides of the aisle. Let's get right into it.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our structured roadmap, so you know exactly how we're going to unpack this highly polarized issue impartially today. We'll start with the starting line, then move into the safe routes debate, deporting foreign criminals, the ECHR bottleneck, and finally wrap up with reform versus radical action. Section 1. The starting line. To truly grasp the intensity of this debate, we really have to look at the sheer scale of the baseline statistics both sides are trying to manage. The stakes here are incredibly high. We begin with a staggering number presented by the opposition, 76,000. That's the number of people who have dangerously crossed the English Channel by small boat since the last election. The opposition emphasizes that these crossings are undertaken primarily by young men, all of whom are leaving what is demonstrably a safe country, France. Furthermore, they pointed out something really crucial. While overall removal numbers might actually look up on paper, about 85% of those removals are voluntary. That means people are leaving of their own accord. They aren't being forcibly deported by the state. In fact, only a tiny fraction, roughly 5 to 7%, relates to people who actually arrived by small boat. Now, combine that figure with this one, 109,000. According to the debate data, last year saw the highest number of asylum claims in UK history, sitting right around that 109,000 mark. And the current year? Well, it's expected to be only slightly less. This paints a vivid and frankly daunting picture of an immigration and asylum system that absolutely everyone in the House of Commons agrees is stretched to its absolute limits. So how exactly do we fix it? Well, this brings us to the fundamental clash of the entire debate. The government strategy is to pivot to a managed system. They want to aggressively target the human smuggling gangmasters while simultaneously opening up safe, legal routes for those in need. In stark contrast, the opposition argues that you absolutely must get illegal immigration and small boat crossings down to zero first. And how do they want to do that? Primarily by ensuring that almost everyone arriving illegally is deported immediately upon arrival. Only then, they argue, can you even begin to discuss limited legal routes. Section 2. The safe routes debate. All right, let's transition to our first major battleground, the concept of safe and legal routes. This is highly contested, and the two sides view the impact of these routes in entirely different ways. From the government's perspective, introducing safe and legal routes accomplishes two main things. First, it allows the UK to fulfill its international obligations to help those displaced by war and human rights abuses globally. But practically speaking, the Home Secretary argued that providing these controlled routes changes the fundamental calculus for migrants. By offering a legal pathway, the government aims to directly cut off the tens of thousands of pounds per person that's currently flowing straight into the hands of criminal people smugglers operating over in northern France. And this brilliantly illustrates the other side of the coin. The opposition vehemently disagrees with that approach. They argue that creating new legal routes while the system is already struggling to process 109,000 claims is irresponsible. They assert that unless you literally offer a route to every single person waiting in France, the boats just aren't going to stop. More critically, the opposition argues these legal routes act as a massive magnet or a pull factor. They cited data showing that for many nationalities crossing the channel, like Afghans, Iranians, and Iraqis, the asylum grant rate is sitting at well over 90%. They claim this effectively acts as an amnesty, sending a signal that crossing by small boat practically guarantees you the right to stay. Section 3. Deporting foreign criminals. While the asylum debate is definitely fierce, the conversation around deporting foreign national offenders, or FNOs, brings out incredibly raw frustrations on the floor. But before we look at the divide, we actually have a moment of rare cross-party agreement. Both the government and the opposition openly agreed during this debate that the current legal system, specifically the immigration appeal system, modern slavery laws, and human rights laws, is being abused on an industrial scale by foreign criminals who are seeking to avoid deportation through repeated vexatious claims. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is where the system is failing, according to the opposition's data. When breaking the numbers down, a stark contrast emerges. For foreign criminals from Eastern European countries like Albania, Romania, or Poland, the removal numbers are actually quite strong relative to the offender population. But take a look at the bottom row. For countries outside of Europe, like Jamaica, Iraq, Nigeria, and Somalia, the success rate just plummets.
The opposition noted that out of 1,150 offenders from these specific countries sitting in prison, only 110, so less than 10%, were successfully removed last year.
Section 4. The ECHR bottleneck.
So, why is that success rate so unbelievably low for certain regions? Well, that brings us directly to the crux of the legal clash slowing down these deportations: the European Convention on Human Rights, or ECHR. This framework sits at the very heart of why deportations get delayed or canceled. The ECHR contains several articles that critics argue are being openly weaponized. You've got Article 8, the right to family life; Article 3, the right against inhumane treatment; Article 6, the right to a fair trial; and alongside all this is ECAT, a European treaty specifically governing modern slavery claims. The debate highlighted cases where offenders make 2 or 3 contradictory human rights claims, plus modern slavery claims, essentially dragging the deportation process out for years. One example cited took 8 full years to resolve after a criminal had already finished his prison sentence. To really drive home their belief that this framework is failing to protect the British public, the opposition shared some shocking specific anecdotes directly from the courts. Again, we're reporting these impartially just to show the arguments being made. They cited an armed robber who actually avoided deportation to Nigeria because courts ruled his mental health needs wouldn't be perfectly accommodated over there. In another case, a drug dealer wasn't sent back to Iraq on human rights grounds because he had supposedly become too westernized. They even cited a case where a man was taken off a deportation charter flight to Jamaica due to an Article 8 claim, only to tragically commit a murder on the streets of South London just 6 months later.
Section 5. Reform versus radical action.
Let's move to our final section and see how all of this builds into the ultimate philosophical clash of the debate. Both sides agree the system is completely broken, but their solutions could not be further apart. This raw, emotional quote from a highly vocal critic of the government really captures the intense energy in the room. They argue that the government's new bill is an absolute betrayal, predicting it will fail entirely. Why? Because it tries to work within the confines of the European Convention on Human Rights, rather than dismantling the UK's relationship with it. The government, however, is proposing a much more measured, step-by-step approach to fixing the system from within. Their bill seeks to amend domestic laws to tackle the abuses of the immigration tribunal system head-on. They want to better define Article 8 within domestic UK law to tighten those loopholes we just talked about. Furthermore, the Home Secretary proposed increasing the qualification period for indefinite leave to remain, which is essentially permanent residency, to 10 years. This is aimed at preventing people, including those who arrived on skilled worker visas sponsored by fast food shops, from securing permanent rights and full benefits too quickly. But critics completely dismiss this as mere tinkering. The opposition argues that previous governments have tried this exact same thing, citing past efforts like Section 63 of the Nationality and Borders Act, and that domestic judges, empowered by the Human Rights Act, simply strike down the legislation and circumvent Parliament anyway. Therefore, they argue for tearing the whole thing up. They want to exit the ECHR completely, repeal the Human Rights Act entirely, and leave the modern slavery ECAT treaty. They believe this radical action is literally the only way to actually deport offenders and deter those small boat crossings.
So the fundamental question we're left with is this: can the UK successfully fix its migration and deportation system by reforming its domestic laws from within the boundaries of international treaties? Or is a radical exit from the ECHR ultimately inevitable to regain control? It's a massive policy collision, and the outcome will undoubtedly define the UK's borders for a generation. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and definitely keep your eyes on how this data continues to unfold.